When I was called in for the interview, I thought it was a joke. Area 51. The name alone sounded like a password for some conspiracy theorist club. But the call was real, as was the offer. A hefty salary, benefits I didn't even know existed, and the promise that, if hired, my military record would be wiped clean like a fresh sheet of paper. It was hard to refuse. The selection process was brutal. Psychologists, interrogations that felt more like mental torture sessions, and physical tests that reminded me of the worst days of military training. All of this in facilities that seemed ripped straight out of a sci-fi movie. Sterile corridors, white lights that seemed to see more than they illuminated, and security guards with hard stares that seemed to judge my every move. When I was accepted, the only thing they told me was, "From now on, your life belongs to the protocol." My first glimpse of the real Area 51 was a deserted road, surrounded by distant mountains and the silhouettes of dead trees. I was escorted by a military jeep that looked like it had been pulled from a museum to a metal fence stretching beyond the horizon. A gate opened, and a man with an impeccable uniform and cold eyes was waiting for me. "Ryan, right?" His voice was low, almost cutting. "I'm Major Lewis. Follow me." He led me into the facility, where I passed through 3 security checkpoints. Facial scanning, biometrics, and finally, something he called cognitive verification. I never figured out what that actually was, but it felt like my mind had been pulled from my skull and returned in fragments. As we walked through the corridors, I noticed an oppressive silence in the air. Not the kind that brings peace, but the kind that screams something is wrong. The walls were metallic, and there were cameras in every corner, some blinking faintly as if studying me. "This is the rule book." Lewis handed me a clipboard. The paper seemed simple, but its contents made me frown. Security rules, Area 51. Always double-check that the cells are sealed before ending your shift. If you hear footsteps behind you in Corridor 7, don't turn around, just run. Never, under any circumstances, enter Block D alone. If the alarm sounds 3 times in succession, evacuate the building immediately and proceed to the designated meeting point. Never touch the burn marks on the walls of Block B. And the list went on, each rule stranger than the last. "Is this serious?" I asked. Lewis didn't answer immediately. He stopped in the corridor, stared at me for a moment, then said, "Follow the rules or you won't make it out alive." His tone was low, but there was no mistaking the weight of the implied threat. I swallowed hard and tucked the clipboard away. Training began that night. I was assigned an instructor named Rick, a thin, pale man with dark circles under his eyes that looked like craters. He never smiled, and if he tried, I doubted it would be convincing. As we walked through the corridors, he pointed out numbered cells with reinforced doors. "These are sectors A through C. Each sector houses, let's call them specific residents. Don't ask what's inside. You don't want to know." I almost laughed. How could anyone work in a place like this without asking questions? It was like being hired to put out fires but told to ignore what was burning. But the jokes died in my throat when we passed Block D. The corridor lights were dimmer, and the feeling of being watched grew with each step. "That's the block you're to avoid." Rick pointed to the end of the corridor. "Things that defy human sanity are in there. If you hear anything from inside, pretend you didn't." His casual tone was somehow worse than Lewis's. It didn't feel like a warning. It felt like resignation. Hours later, while checking some cameras in the control room, I heard something. It was a guttural sound, a low, drawn-out growl that reverberated as if it came from within the walls. "What was that?" I asked, trying not to sound alarmed. Rick, standing next to me, was still for a moment. Then, he simply changed the subject, pointing to another monitor and explaining some protocol. But the silence that followed his explanation was more deafening than the growl. That night, as I lay down in the barracks, Lewis's words replayed in my mind. "Follow the rules or you won't make it out alive." I just didn't know that soon I'd start to believe him. Life at Area 51 followed an oppressive routine. My patrols were long and monotonous. interrupted only by the occasional sound of reinforced doors closing or the faint hum of camera monitors. Despite that, there was a constant, unsettling tension in the air, like something could go wrong at any moment. Over time, I got to know some of the other team members. Harrison stood out first, a veteran with graying hair and eyes that never stopped scanning his surroundings. He seemed to live in a perpetual state of alertness. Harrison was the kind of person you noticed before they even opened their mouth, and when he spoke, it was almost always to criticize or warn about something. "Rule number 1 here," he said once, adjusting his security vest, "don't trust anything. Not what you see, not what you hear, and definitely not what you're told. Not even you?" I joked, trying to lighten the mood. He didn't laugh, not even a smile. He just gave me a look that said more than any words could. Elena, on the other hand, was almost the opposite. A scientist, young, with her hair tied back in a ponytail and an expression of constant focus. She was always buried in reports or pacing with a clipboard full of notes. When I finally got a chance to talk to her, it was during a break in the cafeteria, where the food was as bland as the environment. "So, what exactly do you do?" I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up, clearly exhausted. "I work in the labs. My group handles biocontainment." "And what does that mean?" "It means that if something escapes, we're all screwed." The blunt way she said it didn't help. I smiled nervously, but she didn't smile back. The routine began to change on the 4th night during my night patrol. The radio on my belt crackled, and an urgent scientist's voice came through. "Code yellow in Lab 3. We need support now." Grabbing my flashlight, I ran to the indicated location, adrenaline surging. When I arrived at the lab, chaos had already begun. Scientists were retreating to the corners of the room, shouting confused orders at each other. In the center of the room, something moved among the metallic tables. It was a small creature, the size of a rat, but deformed in a way that made my skin crawl. It had 6 needle-thin legs, a segmented body that gleamed like wet glass, and antennas that twitched frantically. Around it, the steel floor was corroded, with smoking patches of some acidic substance. "What the hell is that?" I asked, keeping my eyes locked on the thing. "Just keep your distance," Elena shouted, adjusting some sort of non-lethal weapon. "It's one of the experimental units. It shouldn't be out here." The creature moved suddenly, too fast for something so small. It climbed onto a nearby table, leaving a trail of smoke on the steel surface. One of the scientists tried to push it back with a baton, but the thing spat a jet of liquid that melted the object in seconds. The chemical stench that filled the air was unbearable, like acid mixed with burning flesh. Harrison showed up shortly after, holding a weapon that looked far too heavy to be standard issue. "Get out of the way," he shouted, aiming at the creature. Before he could fire, Elena stepped between him and the target. "No, you might hit the containers behind it." She pointed to a row of glass tubes filled with glowing liquids. "That could destroy the entire lab." Harrison lowered the weapon with a curse, but his eyes remained fixed on the creature. Elena was the one who finally neutralized it, using the non-lethal weapon to fire a special net that immobilized the creature. Even restrained, it thrashed violently, its antennae striking the air until it finally went still. After the lab was evacuated and the creature isolated, I found myself alone with Harrison in the corridor. The silence between us was almost as suffocating as the lingering stench in the air. "Does this happen often around here?" I asked, trying to mask my discomfort. He glanced at me sideways, letting out a dry laugh. "You think this was bad? Wait until you see what's in Block D." Harrison walked away, leaving me alone to process what I had just witnessed. The image of that thing moving across the tables, corroding metal like paper, wouldn't leave my mind. It wasn't natural. It wasn't something that should exist. As I returned to the barracks, one thing became clear. Area 51 wasn't a place for military secrets. It was a prison for horrors the world wasn't ready to face. On the 5th night, I was assigned to Patrol Corridor 7. The name didn't mean much to me at first, but the look on Harrison's face when he heard the instruction told me this wasn't just another point on my route. Corridor 7, huh, he said, lighting a cigarette in the parking lot. Something strictly prohibited. Good luck, rookie. Why? I asked, trying to sound indifferent. Harrison took a long drag, exhaling the smoke slowly. Read the rulebook again, and whatever you hear, don't look back. That last sentence stuck with me as I prepared for the patrol. Corridor 7 was explicitly mentioned in the rules, and not in a way that inspired confidence. I decided to memorize the rule. If you hear footsteps behind you in Corridor 7, don't look back. Just run. Corridor 7 was in an isolated section of the facility, beyond Block C. The lighting there was different, less intense, as if the lamps were intentionally dimmed to avoid fully illuminating the space. The cameras were larger, and I noticed that each door had at least 2 extra layers of reinforced locks. I walked slowly, trying to ignore the muffled sound of my own footsteps echoing off the metallic walls. The place felt colder than the rest of the facility, and the air carried a strange smell, like rusty iron mixed with something chemical. It wasn't just the appearance. There was something wrong about that place. When I reached the middle of the corridor, I noticed the marks. On the right wall, there were 4 deep scratches, as if made by giant claws tearing through the metal. The cuts were precise, clean, and had what looked like burn marks along the edges. I looked around, trying to find anything else that could explain them. The doors, sealed and covered in security locks, looked like they had been reinforced multiple times. Some even had additional plates with codes I didn't recognize. And then I heard it. Above me, coming from the false ceiling, there was a faint sound, like something crawling. The noise was irregular, alternating between a sliding motion and a tapping, as if hard nails were scraping against the metal above my head. I gripped my flashlight tighter, my heart racing. I knew what the rules said, but the curiosity was almost unbearable. I took a step back, slowly, as the sound continued. It seemed to follow my movements, adjusting its position to match mine. On impulse, I nearly pointed the light upward, but Harrison's words returned to my mind like a whisper. Whatever you hear, don't look back. The sound stopped for a moment, only to start again, closer this time. I could swear I felt something above me, a presence, something that shouldn't be there. But I forced myself to ignore it, tightening my grip on the flashlight. I took a deep breath, counted to 3, and kept walking, trying to appear indifferent. Hours later, in the cafeteria, I couldn't focus on my meal. The feeling of being watched in Corridor 7 still weighed on me. Harrison joined me uninvited, dragging a chair noisily across the floor. "So, how was it?" he asked, with a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I heard something in the ceiling," I admitted, tossing my fork onto the plate and crossing my arms. "But I ignored it." Harrison nodded slowly, as if evaluating my response. "Smart. That probably saved your life. What's in that corridor?" I asked, trying to hide my nervousness. "And don't tell me I don't want to know. I'm already here, and anything that helps me not die is welcome." Harrison hesitated for a moment, leaning forward. "What you heard, that wasn't something, that was it. The Void Stalker." He paused, glancing around before continuing. "It's a predator. We don't know where it came from or what it really is. All we know is that it hunts by movement, and no one who looked directly at it lived to tell the tale." The name sounded absurd, like something out of a cheap horror story, but Harrison's tone was serious. He continued, "The false ceiling in that corridor is its territory. Stays there, waiting. If you stop, it notices. If you look, it acts. That's why the rule is clear. Run and don't look back." The last person who ignored it. He let the sentence hang in the air, nodding toward one of the cafeteria's security cameras. "Let's just say we had to erase the footage. The silence between us was suffocating." Finally, Harrison stood up, leaving a warning before he walked away. Consider yourself lucky today, rookie. But luck doesn't last forever. That night, alone in the barracks, I tried convincing myself that Harrison was exaggerating. But I couldn't. I knew what I had heard. That thing wasn't imaginary. And whatever was in Corridor 7, it was as real as the rulebook, now etched into my mind like a survival mantra. If you hear footsteps behind you in Corridor 7, don't look back. Just run. At Area 51, the routine was carefully calibrated, like an invisible clock where every second seemed under absolute control. But that night, when the regular lights went out and the oppressive red glow of emergency lighting flooded the corridors, I felt something more than disorientation. It was a premonition. My radio crackled, and the voice of a supervisor echoed through the static. All available agents, reinforcement needed in Lab 2. Contingency code L4. Repeat, contingency L4. Code L4 was serious. I didn't know exactly what it meant, but judging by the tone of the voice on the radio, it wasn't good. I grabbed my flashlight, adjusted my vest, and made my way to the designated lab, moving through corridors now bathed in that oppressive crimson glow. When I arrived, a small team was already there. Scientists were frantically adjusting equipment, and security agents held weapons that looked more futuristic than functional. Elena stood at the center of it all, wearing a full protective suit that made her look like she was about to take a stroll on the moon. "What's going on here?" I asked, trying to mask my unease. Elena didn't even turn around, too busy adjusting a panel that displayed magnified images of something that looked gray. "Gray microbes," she said, as if the name explained everything. When she noticed my expression, she sighed and elaborated. "They're microscopic organisms that consume organic matter in seconds. Extremely dangerous. We're monitoring an experiment with them. And what's the problem?" She shot me a quick glance through the transparent visor of her suit. "The problem, Ryan, is that if anything goes wrong, a single drop could consume this entire facility." I stayed silent, watching as the scientists worked. On the central lab table, a transparent container held a gray, opaque liquid in constant motion, as if it had a life of its own. Beneath it, a lab rat was trapped in a small cage. Beginning the test, Elena announced as the others adjusted the environment. The lights in the lab dimmed, and a mechanical arm began to lower slowly toward the rat. "Is this safe?" I asked, glancing at the others. No one answered. The mechanical arm released a single drop of the gray liquid into the space between the rat and the bottom of the cage. What happened next was too fast to process. The rat instinctively jumped back, but it was too late. The drop expanded like a wave, enveloping the animal in the blink of an eye. There was no sound, no scream, no squeal, just a gaping void at the bottom of the cage where, seconds earlier, a living rat had been. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise I had ever heard. "Now you understand why the rules are so strict," Elena said, still staring at the container. "Always wear protective suits, and never, ever touch any liquid outside sealed containers." As they monitored the experiment's data, a faint sound caught my attention. A drip. I looked around, searching for the source, until my eyes landed on a nearby table. There it was, a droplet of gray liquid, wobbling on the edge of the container as if about to fall. "Elena!" I shouted, pointing. She turned immediately and rushed to the table, shouting orders to the other scientists. Before the drop could fall, one of the mechanical arms activated a containment barrier, sealing the table within an energy field. Even so, the red glow of the emergency lights made the scene feel even more ominous. "This shouldn't have happened," Elena muttered, more to herself than anyone else. When the experiment was shut down, I felt a relief I barely had time to process. Elena removed her helmet and gave me a serious look. "The rulebook you were given, it's not a set of suggestions, Ryan. It exists because places like this," she gestured around her, "aren't made for human error I nodded, unsure what to say. The next day, I was in the control room when the alarm sounded. 3 short blares followed by 1 long. This wasn't the evacuation code, but it was serious. The voice over the intercom was urgent, with a tone I hadn't heard before. Incident in Block D containment teams. Prepare. Block D, the place everyone avoided. I immediately stood up, adjusted my gear, and grabbed my flashlight. The corridor was chaotic, with scientists running back and forth, murmuring anxiously as they checked tablets and communicators. Elena passed by me, already dressed in a containment suit, and her expression said it all. Something terrible was happening. "You're assigned?" she asked. "Yes." "What happened?" She hesitated, then said, "An agent went in alone. He shouldn't have been there." My mind flashed to the rules. The third one was clear. Never, under any circumstances, enter Block D alone. "Who was it?" I asked as I followed her to the elevator. She looked away. "Johnson." I remembered him. A stocky guy, a veteran, always with an ironic smile. But now that smile felt distant, a relic of a time that had already passed. When I reached Block D, the atmosphere was suffocating. The lights were dimmer than usual, alarms still flashing red intermittently. The smell in the air was metallic, almost like blood mixed with ammonia. The scene ahead was a nightmare. Johnson was on the floor, or at least what was left of him. His body was covered in something that moved in waves, insects. Tiny, black creatures with jaws that gleamed in the siren lights. They were scattered across the floor, but the largest concentration swarmed around him, devouring what remained of his flesh. Within seconds, I watched one of his hands disappear, leaving only exposed bones. "Oh my God," I murmured, fighting the urge to vomit. Harrison stood beside me, holding an improvised flamethrower. "Stay behind me. These bastards fear nothing, but heat keeps them back." He fired the flamethrower, and a wave of fire swept across the floor, scattering the insects in a frenzy. Some exploded, while others retreated into the shadows, but the swarm seemed endless, emerging from cracks in the walls and crevices in the ceiling. Elena arrived moments later, shouting orders to the other scientists. "Maximum containment. Seal access to Block D now." The sight of Johnson's remains and the relentless swarm was burned into my memory as the containment doors slammed shut behind us. Whatever was in Block D, it was more than just a secret. It was a reminder of why some rules should never be broken. Reinforced doors began to close around us, but they didn't seem to deter the insects. They kept coming, more frenzied with every moment. Harrison shoved me back as a group advanced toward us, releasing another blast of fire. "We're going to lose this entire place if we don't act fast," he shouted. After minutes that felt like hours, we managed to contain the swarm, or at least isolate it. Block D was sealed, and a specialized team was called in to clean up the remains. Johnson, or what was left of him, was carried away in a black bag that seemed almost empty. I sat on the floor, trying to catch my breath, when I overheard 2 scientists talking. "This is getting out of control. They're reproducing faster than expected. We've already warned them about this. No one wants to listen. They think they can contain everything." I glanced at Elena, who was nearby but said nothing. Her face was pale, her eyes fixed on some distant point. She knew something she wasn't sharing. Later, back in the barracks, whispered conversations confirmed what I feared. Block D was becoming unstable. The genetically modified insects, created for experiments no one wanted to explain, were adapting. They were getting smarter, more aggressive, and apparently there was no way to fully contain them. "This is going to get worse before it gets better," Harrison said, sitting on my bed and drinking from a metal flask. "Better?" I asked skeptically. He let out a bitter laugh. "Sorry, I think I meant before it ends." The memory of Johnson being devoured alive wouldn't leave my mind. For the first time since arriving at Area 51, I began to question whether this place should even exist. and worse, whether we would survive to tell anyone what we'd seen. After the incident in Block D, the silence in the base became more oppressive than ever. The whispered conversations, furtive glances among the scientists, and Harrison's even more paranoid behavior all contributed to the feeling that we were inside a pressure cooker about to explode. I needed answers. Elena was the only person on the base I felt I could talk to. She seemed to know more than the others, but unlike Harrison, she wasn't afraid to share small fragments of information. I invited her for coffee in the cafeteria after hours, something rare in a place where casual interactions felt almost taboo. To my surprise, she accepted. We sat in a secluded corner, away from the cameras and constant surveillance. The coffee was terrible, but the empty atmosphere was a welcome relief. Elena stared at the table, deep in thought, as she slowly spun her mug between her hands. "Are you okay?" I asked, breaking the silence. She sighed, lifting her eyes to meet mine. "As okay as anyone who works here can be." We were quiet for a few moments before I finally asked, "What's really going on in this base, Elena? Not the obvious stuff. I mean, the truth." She hesitated. It was as though she was battling herself, weighing whether it was worth telling me. Finally, she spoke. "You think most of the things here are alien, don't you?" I nodded slowly. "Isn't that what they say?" She let out a bitter laugh. "Yes, that's what they say. But the truth is, many of the horrors you've seen here didn't come from space. They came from us." I frowned, confused. "What do you mean?" "Humans, experiments, genetics, nanotechnology, artificial intelligence, all pushed to the limit, beyond what we should have done. Take what happened in Block D, for example." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "Those insects were created here, Ryan. They're not from another planet." I stayed silent, processing. It was hard to believe, but it made sense. "And the aliens? They exist, right?" She nodded, but there was something in her expression that hinted the answer was more complicated than it seemed. "Some. They're not like in the movies. Many are incomprehensible. Beings that don't communicate like we do, that don't perceive the world the way we do. Some were captured on secret missions. Others simply appeared." Elena glanced around, ensuring we were alone. Then she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "But nothing here compares to Prisoner X. The mention of that name made me shiver. Who or what is it?" She hesitated again, her fingers tightening around the edge of her mug. "I don't know exactly, and that's what scares me. Prisoner X is kept on the deepest level of the base, in a cell made of materials I can't even identify. No one on the team has ever seen it directly. Not even the scientists assigned to it know what it is." I held my breath for a moment. "Why is it here?" She looked directly at me, her eyes more serious than I'd ever seen them. "Because it's dangerous. Not just to us, but to everything." I swallowed hard, feeling a knot growing in my stomach. "What do you mean by everything?" She looked away, as if regretting saying so much. "Enough to justify this entire facility. But there's a problem." I stared at her, waiting. "Its cell is showing signs of wear." The words hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. "What do you mean, wear?" I asked, trying to stay calm. "The walls, the barriers." She shook her head. "They're weakening. No one knows why." After that, Elena went silent. I knew I wouldn't get anything more out of her that night. But what little she had shared was enough to fuel an unease that wouldn't go away anytime soon. Back in my quarters, I replayed everything in my mind. Area 51 was far more than a repository of extraterrestrial secrets. It was a laboratory, a zoo, a prison for the horrors humanity had created, and in some cases, discovered. My routine that morning seemed normal, as much as anything in Area 51 could be called normal. The white lights once again illuminated the corridors, and the metallic echo of my footsteps was oddly comforting after the shadows of the previous night. But that comfort was fragile, like a sheet of paper about to be torn. I was patrolling Corridor 5 when I saw it. A figure wearing the same uniform as mine, standing with its back to me, completely still like a statue. At first, I thought it was Harrison or another team member, maybe checking on something. "Hey!" I called out, getting no response. I took a step forward, trying not to sound impatient. "Is everything okay?" Still nothing. The strangeness of the situation began to sink in. Something felt off about the way they were standing, too tense, as if every muscle was locked in an unnatural angle. I tightened my grip on the flashlight, my fingers slipping against the sweat forming on my palms. Then I noticed it. The uniform. It was identical to mine. Even the badge pinned to the chest had my name on it. A chill ran down my spine, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I took another step forward, trying to ignore the overwhelming feeling that this thing shouldn't be here. The figure tilted its head slightly to the side, as if listening to something distant. Then a sound echoed through the corridor, not from where I was standing, but from the figure itself. A scream. It was my scream. The voice echoed with terrifying precision, reverberating off the metallic walls. My blood ran cold, and my feet moved backward on their own. My mind screamed one thing, the rule. If you encounter a duplicate, do not engage. Walk away immediately. I ran. My heart pounded like a sledgehammer in my chest as I sprinted through the corridors, not daring to look back. The sound of the scream still echoed in my head, looping endlessly like a broken record. I didn't stop until I reached the central control room, slamming the door shut behind me and leaning against it for support. Elena was there, bent over a monitor, and she turned with a worried expression. "What happened?" I couldn't speak right away. Still gasping for breath, I pointed back toward the corridor. A man, me, he was there. But it wasn't me. Her expression changed immediately. Her posture stiffened, and she shot a quick glance at Harrison, who was in the corner of the room. He stopped what he was doing and came over to us. "You saw a duplicate?" he asked, his voice heavier than usual. I nodded, sweat dripping down my temples. I did what the rule said. I didn't interact. I just ran. Harrison nodded, but Elena looked deeply unsettled. "Ryan, we need to talk." She pulled me aside to a quieter corner of the room and began speaking in a low, urgent tone. "Those duplicates aren't real people. They're not you. They come from something we call the fragmented dimension. We don't know much about it except that it's hostile." I stared at her, struggling to keep up. "And what do they want?" She hesitated, as if the words were difficult to say. "They feed on fear. They enter your mind, extract your deepest memories, and create illusions. They mimic your appearance, your voice, even your thoughts. Their goal is to lure you in, confuse you, and then..." She stopped. "And then..." pressed. "And then you disappear." The rest of the day passed in a blur as I tried to process what she had said. Every detail of the base felt like a piece of a sinister puzzle, and the more I put together, the less I wanted to see the full picture. That night, back in the barracks, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. The image of the figure in the corridor was burned into my mind. What haunted me most, though, was the scream. It didn't just sound like my scream. It sounded like one I knew I would make someday. A scream of desperation. A scream of death. The alarm that night wasn't a warning or a call to action. It was a cry of despair. I was in the barracks, trying to shake the memory of my encounter with the duplicate, when the lights began to flicker. The high-pitched, relentless blare of the sirens echoed through the base, louder and more intense than any alarm I'd ever heard before. This wasn't the usual protocol. It was something else entirely. My radio crackled, and Major Lewis's voice came through, sharp and urgent. "All available agents to block C Code Red. Repeat, Code Red, Code Red." The term was etched into the protocol as the worst kind of emergency. A containment breach. I grabbed my flashlight and ran through the corridors, now plunged into chaos. The emergency lights bathed everything in pulsing red, and the sound of the alarms hammered in my skull with every step. When I reached Block C, the scene before me was like something out of a nightmare. The reinforced doors of one of the cells were open, twisted as if they'd been torn apart from the inside. The remains of a containment team were scattered across the floor. Shattered armor, destroyed weapons, and blood. So much blood. In the center of the corridor, something moved. The Bone Wanderer was a creature I'd only heard about in rumors among the guards. They said it was kept in maximum containment for a reason, but no one knew exactly what it was until now. The thing was tall, nearly 3 meters, with a humanoid body that looked grotesquely assembled. Its limbs were disjointed, like pieces of a puzzle hurriedly forced together, yet it moved with an unnatural fluidity. Its skin was thin, almost translucent, stretched over a structure of bones that seemed to shift constantly, as though they were alive. It turned its head with a movement too fast to be human, its eyes, or what seemed to be eyes, glowing with a lifeless, dull hue. Harrison appeared at my side, holding a heavy weapon I'd never seen before. "Ryan, keep your distance. That thing is a killing machine." Before I could respond, the Bone Wanderer charged. The corridor erupted into chaos. Harrison fired his weapon, but the shots barely seemed to faze the creature. It moved too quickly for something that size, its disproportionate arms swinging like sledgehammers and smashing into the walls. One of the security personnel didn't get out of the way in time. The creature's arm went straight through his chest like paper. "Fall back," someone shouted, but it was already too late. The creature twisted its body, the sheer force of the motion slamming 2 people against the walls. I stood frozen, watching the carnage, until Harrison yanked me backward. "Get out of here now," he shouted before resuming his attack. I ran, but not far. My mind screamed that I needed to help, to do something. But what could I possibly do against that? Finally, a specialized containment team arrived, clad in reinforced suits and wielding weapons that fired energy beams. They surrounded the Bone Wanderer, moving in formation as the air filled with screams and the sound of metal being torn apart. The battle was brutal. The creature fought with relentless ferocity, tearing through parts of Block C before it was finally subdued. Even as it collapsed to the ground, writhing in spasms, it seemed alive, like it was waiting for the right moment to strike again. The teams began sealing the area, but the damage was already done. Much of Block C was rendered unusable, and the bodies of the security personnel and scientists had to be collected. Later, Harrison found me in the cafeteria, his expression grim and exhausted. "This wasn't the first time something like this has happened," he said, slumping heavily into the chair across from me. "But it was the worst." I said nothing. I was still trying to process what I'd witnessed. "You know what this means, don't you?" he continued, pointing at me with a trembling finger. "We're losing control." Back in my quarters, those words echoed in my mind. The base had always seemed indestructible, a fortress built to contain the impossible. But now, after everything I'd seen, that facade was crumbling. Another day, another alarm, this time in Block A. It wasn't unusual for the sirens to go off due to a technical error or minor issue, but the voice over the radio quickly made it clear this was real. "Chemical emergency in Block A, repeat, chemical emergency. Immediate evacuation." I arrived at the scene to find chaos. Scientists in protective gear were rushing around while security teams tried to organize the evacuation. "What's going on?" I asked, stopping next to Elena, who was suited up in containment gear. "Gray microbes," she said, adjusting the visor on her helmet. "A sample escaped during a transfer." I looked past her and saw the reason for the alarm. A gray liquid was spreading slowly across the metal floor, but not naturally. It moved like a living organism, engulfing everything in its path. Where it touched, the metal dissolved, releasing a greenish vapor that made the air difficult to breathe even through a mask. "Is it contained?" I asked, my voice more nervous than I intended. She shook her head. "Not yet." The evacuation was quick but tense. Some scientists hesitated, trying to save equipment or samples, but the orders were clear: leave immediately. I herded them down the corridor as the gray liquid continued its relentless advance, consuming tables, chairs, and even part of the wall. Finally, the doors to Blocka were sealed, but the camera feeds showed that the problem was far from resolved. From the central control room, we watched as a team of scientists and engineers activated an experimental weapon. It looked like a flamethrower but fired a bluish substance instead of fire. When it hit the microbes, the substance seemed to freeze them, slowing their movement before breaking them down. "Will it work?" I asked, watching the footage. "Maybe," Harrison replied, his eyes glued to the monitor. "Or maybe it'll just buy us a little more time before everything goes to hell." He wasn't wrong. Even with the blue substance neutralizing part of the microbes, the damage was immense. Much of Block A's structure had been corroded, and the gases released continued to seep into other sectors. As I watched the operation unfold, one question kept forming in my mind: how much longer can this last? That night, alone in my quarters, the question wouldn't leave me. Area 51 was full of things that could destroy the entire base, and we were teetering closer to losing control with every passing day. Maybe we already had. The atmosphere in the base was more tense than ever. Whispers in the cafeteria, wary glances exchanged between scientists and security personnel, and even brief conversations among the higher-ups hinted that something was about to explode, and it wasn't the microbes or the contained creatures. The mutiny started during the night shift. A group of scientists, led by a man named Dr. Lennox, had decided we couldn't go on. They believed the experiments were a looming disaster and that the creatures should be destroyed, not studied. "You don't understand," I overheard Lennox say to a group of security guards trying to de-escalate the situation. "Every second these things stay here is another second closer to a catastrophe no one will be able to stop." But Lennox wasn't interested in debate. He and his group acted quickly, sabotaging the containment systems of one of the creatures in Block E, the Winged Shadow. I was in the central control room when the alert came in. "We have a breach in Block E," a voice said over the radio. "The Winged Shadow is loose." The corridor where it happened was completely destroyed by the time I arrived. The lights were flickering, and deep gouges marred the walls as if something massive had ripped through the metal with invisible claws. Then I saw it. The Winged Shadow was almost impossible to describe. Its form seemed to waver between the real and the unreal, a black silhouette that absorbed the light around it. Its wings were enormous, bat-like, but folded and moved in ways that defied logic. Wherever it went, an oppressive feeling filled the air, as if gravity itself had shifted. Lennox and his group were in the corridor trying to retreat, but it was already too late. The creature moved with horrifying speed. In an instant, one of the scientists was slammed against the wall with a sickening crunch of breaking bones. Another tried to run, but the creature's wings enveloped him, and he vanished into the darkness. I could do nothing but watch, powerless. The Winged Shadow was contained, but the cost was devastating. Alongside the saboteurs, several innocent security personnel and scientists lost their lives in the process. Harrison was furious, angrier than I'd ever seen him. "Those idiots don't realize they're making everything worse," he shouted. "No matter what you think, Ryan, keeping this here is better than letting it loose on the world." I wasn't sure if he was right. Lennox had believed that destroying everything was the only solution, but now he was dead, and what remained was an even more divided and vulnerable base. Deep down, I knew that this internal division was just as dangerous as any creature we kept locked up inside. A few months passed without anything too severe happening. When the first alarm blared, something inside me already knew what was happening. I was in the central control room, watching the security monitors, when Major Lewis rushed in, his face hard as stone. "Block F, lower level," he said, his voice barely audible over the sound of the sirens. "Containment has failed." Elena, standing beside me, went pale. "It can't be," she murmured. The cell of Prisoner X. The monitors showed the impossible. The reinforced walls of the cell, constructed from materials we didn't fully understand, had been destroyed. A dark void filled the space where the creature had been held. It was as if reality itself had been bent, torn, and devoured. The first thing we noticed was the silence. The alarm stopped, but it brought no relief. If anything, it made things worse. Prisoner X was moving. It was a presence that couldn't be ignored, even without being seen. The cameras captured only flashes of something that seemed at once solid and liquid, a shape that never remained constant for more than a few seconds. As it passed a group of security personnel, they simply dropped to their knees, their weapons clattering to the ground. Their eyes were wide with absolute terror. Some began laughing uncontrollably, while others wept, muttering incoherent words. "He's manipulating them," Elena said, gripping my arm. "He can get into their minds, make them see things that aren't there. How do we stop him?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. No one answered. The security forces sprang into action, but it was futile. The most advanced weapons we had seemed incapable of causing any real harm. A direct energy blast struck Prisoner X, and for a moment, I thought it had worked. But then it simply stood back up, as if nothing had happened. "We're doomed," murmured one of the scientists beside me. The base was falling apart around us. Walls were torn asunder, explosions echoed through the corridors, and screams filled the air. Prisoner X wasn't just trying to escape. It was breaking us, not physically but mentally. I saw it for the first time in the main corridor near the exit to the upper level. His form was indescribable, like staring at something my mind couldn't comprehend. But its eyes, those eyes burned with a strange, piercing light, as if they could see straight into my soul. The evacuation had begun, but it was clear it wouldn't be enough. If Prisoner X reached the surface, it would be the end, not just of the base, but perhaps of all humanity. I was called to an improvised containment room where Elena stood with a group of scientists. She was holding a weapon that looked more like a prototype than anything functional. "This is our last chance," she said, handing the weapon to me. "What is it?" "An experimental weapon. It should be able to neutralize him. If it works." She didn't answer. I headed to the main corridor, where Prisoner X was just about to breach the upper level. With every step it took, more people fell to the ground, immobilized by its telepathic power. I raised the weapon and fired. The shot hit Prisoner X, and for the first time it reacted. The creature let out a sound that was like a scream, but deeper, something I felt in my bones. It charged toward me, and before I could react, I felt a searing pain. I looked down to see its arm, or something like an arm, piercing through my left shoulder. Pulled back, and everything went white. I fell, but I didn't let go of the weapon. With the last of my strength, I fired again. The light from the weapon engulfed Prisoner X, and its form began to disintegrate, dissolving into a dark void that slowly faded away. When I woke up, I was on a stretcher, surrounded by medics. My left arm was gone, amputated where the creature had struck. Harrison stood beside me, his expression as grim as ever. "You did it," he said, his voice softer than I expected. "What happened to the base?" I asked, my voice raspy. "Block F is destroyed, but it didn't escape. A year later, I'm here writing this story. I can't work anymore, not after what I lost. Not just my arm, but my sanity. But someone needs to know the truth. Area 51 isn't just a place for secrets. It's a place where the impossible becomes real, and where the Real can destroy everything."